Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, you know we're in the Endgame. Yes, it's time for Avengers Endgame, the big capper on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And real quick, calls to action this week. We want to thank our new Patreon subscribers, Tyler and Fergal. They are wonderful people because they went to patreon.com/GenreVision, signed up for $5 a month, and now they have access to all our wonderful bonus material on Patreon. And as of now, there's over 24 hours of bonus material for all of our shows. That's GenreVision, Third Time's the Charm, Finflix, and we just keep adding stuff. If you want to support the show, this is the best way to do it right now. Patreon.com/GenreVision. And again, thank you, Tyler and Fergal. Speaking of our other shows, wanted to let you all know that the new episode of Third Time's the Charm is out. Danny and I talked about Back to the Future Part 3, and one of the bonus episodes on Patreon is us talking about Back to the Future 1 and 2. It turned out to be a really fun episode, and it was Danny's first time seeing all those movies, so it was really cool to get a fresh perspective on them. Another thing, and I think I need to pass this off to you, Travis, because this is a wonderful achievement that you got up the day that we're recording this, is the season finale of Finflix.
We did it, yeah. We finally published the last episode of our first season of Finflix. It's our shark movie podcast. This episode is all about Deep Blue Sea, which is a movie that Drew and I like quite a lot. We had a great time making Finflix, and we certainly hope you had a great time listening to it. And of course, we recommend that you listen to the new episode on Deep Blue Sea right now.
And the last call to action, we just want to let everybody know we have a new Ask Us Anything episode coming out on July 14th, so we are currently accepting questions. You can go to genrevision.com/contact, and you can see exactly how you can get in touch with us and submit your questions. And really, it is Ask Us Anything. Obviously, movie-related stuff is our forte. You can ask us not only about GenreVision, but our other shows, Third Time's the Charm and Finflix, and really just about anything. We've had some really fun questions in the past that have been from a variety of topics, so please start submitting those. We love doing those episodes, and we think you guys will like them too. Okay, it is time to talk about Avengers Endgame, possibly the most spoilable movie of all time.
I was going to say, where do we draw the line here? Where does the spoiler wall lie? Because what you've seen in the marketing on this film is very, very little of the actual movie. The marketing did not give much of a sense of what really happens in the movie and what the structure of the film really is. There's huge stuff that happens pretty much immediately that there's really no indication of in the marketing. So I guess we can say that this picks up pretty much directly after Infinity War, and that's really the only that's really the only thing we can say. I mean, do you want to give reactions to this point, or?
Well, okay. Let us get our reactions out of the way, because I think we have to say something up front. If you have listened to this show with any regularity, you might come away with the idea that Travis and I dislike the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies.
We have certainly had listeners express that in the past, that we have a grump on for these movies or that we hate them, and that's pretty far from the truth. There are quite a few of these MCU movies that Drew and I like quite a bit.
Oh, sure, and I rewatched a few before Endgame, so I think it's just that when we've been critical, and these are not movies that often are open to a lot of criticism. But regardless, I mean, I think we have fair criticisms about the MCU in general, about the Russo brothers as directors and style and all this kind of stuff. So I think some people might have the impression that going into Avengers Endgame, either we weren't excited or we kind of came with an axe to grind or whatever. Even if that was the case, which it's not, but even if it was, I think it's fair to say that both Travis and I really enjoyed Avengers Endgame.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And I don't know, I think it's a little disingenuous to say that we weren't dreading this a little bit. I think you and I knew that this was going to be a big deal for a lot of reasons. And I think you and I knew that there was going to be a lot of potential for us to disagree with the audience en masse. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it's because it wasn't going to be as big of a deal for you and me personally as it is to the entirety of pop culture.
Sure.
But I have to admit, I really enjoyed Endgame, and it's going to be hard to talk about that without getting into spoilers. But suffice to say, there will be criticisms about Endgame. I don't think it's some perfect movie or anything. But I do think this is probably the best Avengers movie since the first one.
I would agree, although this, like Infinity War, is not a complete movie. This is the second half of a story that is resolving things from the previous film. And we've seen so many film franchises, so many blockbuster film franchises do this, where they split one giant finale type story across two movies and they film them simultaneously. And we have seen time after time how franchises bungle this. The Matrix, Pirates of the Caribbean,
Hunger Games, Harry Potter.
I mean, the Harry Potter one is not so bad, but those movies are kind of bland. But look, this is the one time it's done it, and I've been thoroughly impressed with the result.
Well, and we often say on this show that impressive does not equate to good all the time. I don't think that's the case with Endgame. I think for the most part, what's impressive about this movie also equates to being successful.
I agree. I think it sets out the goals that it was striving for and pretty much achieves all of them, although the Marvel Cinematic Universe has largely redefined, I think, what people want from a blockbuster film. And that people are treating these more like serialized television. These are now the reasons to go to the movie theater. You and I were kind of dreading this in a big way because you and I don't frequently have great experiences at the theater. Neither you nor I are particularly religious people, but for us, movies are like church. No matter what movie we go to, we like to see a respectful crowd who knows what they're in for and isn't being rude. And I think what we were worried about is, like, we knew the theaters would be packed and we didn't want to have to deal with a lot of rude people. But when I saw this, it was one of the best crowd experiences I'd had in a theater in literally years.
I can't be quite that big, but I felt like my audience was operating as an audience should at every movie they go to. They were respectful. Nobody was chattering a bunch. And they were reacting with the movie appropriately, at times in a way that surprised me. And we can, I think, talk about that when we get more into the plot. But suffice to say, Travis and I liked this movie. There's still things, like I said, we're going to, I think, agree upon in terms of criticism that might be part of our overall feelings about the MCU.
Right. Most of our criticisms, I would say, are kind of tired criticisms about the MCU at this point, but I think it's important that we still iterate them because I think they're things that are worth fighting for.
Sure, I think they're solid. Like, even if they are refrains, it's like they're still doing them. So I think we just throw up the spoiler wall and let's talk about Avengers Endgame openly. So at this point, everybody, you've been warned.
Yep.
I think I might love the first two acts of this movie because Avengers Endgame, I found, was more of a 5-act movie than your typical 3-act structure.
It's like a 5 or 6 act movie. So I kind of, like, as soon as I figured out what it would be, I kind of threw the idea of typical 3-act structure of blockbuster films out. And I said, you know what? This movie's doing its own thing as far as structure goes. So I'm just going to roll with it. This is, in a sense, the whole Return of the King thing. You know, it's a story that is as long as it needs to be, with a surprising and one might say excessive amount of fan service, but it doesn't feel excessive when it works as well as it does in Return of the King or in Avengers Endgame, which are firing on all cylinders when it comes to fan service. Because it's not just about making fans happy by, giving them sugar. It's really about delivering on things that have substance to them. And I like that quite a bit.
I would say this isn't a case of, look, clap because it's things you know. It's not a, look, you know what an AT-AT walker is, clap, you monkeys.
Right.
Like, it's not that kind of fan service. It's, you have been sticking with these characters for so long, and we're going to pay off emotional moments. And emotional doesn't just mean, crying or sad stuff. It means rousing moments, too. We're in the spoiler wall, so we might get a little all over the place with this. For example, in the final fight sequence, Cap gets to wield Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. And I was so stoked. I let out a little like, yeah, moment. It pays off because of a little moment in Age of Ultron.
That's right. Yeah, that's really all it takes. It just gives you this little hint of like, this guy, he might be worthy. And so they could have done nothing with that, or they could have given us that option to wait a while and see if they were going to go someplace with it. And of course, they expertly build up to a point where Cap is almost beaten. And then when he finally picks up the hammer, you know that there's going to be a second win. So the way that they structure the fight in that way, where you think, oh my God, he's going to die. And then of course he gets the hammer. And so this sort of fight back and forth, it's like watching a really amazing hockey game in overtime, you know, for the Stanley Cup win. You know what I mean? Like the stakes feel high. The way that they actually managed to build toward that, I think, is really masterful. So, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, the screenwriters credited with the screenplay on this one, major kudos to them. But also, Marvel Studios has a big staff of in-house writers that break these stories to figure out how to structure them. So I got to say, from a writing standpoint, this movie is nothing short of masterful.
I agree. I was so pleased and satisfied with the movie from a structural standpoint, because going back to the beginning, this first act is basically the immediate fallout of Infinity War. And we have everybody teaming up. We got to go try and find Thanos. And the movie gives us just enough of a sense of where everybody's headspace is at. You know, Tony dying off in space and then getting rescued and being extremely, you know, despondent to the point where he has to be, you know, he's not because he's despondent, but because he's malnourished. He has to, you know, be sedated and medicated and everything. But in the first maybe 20 minutes or so of this movie, they go find Thanos and kill him.
Yeah.
And it's a shocking moment. It's surprisingly violent, especially for these MCU movies. And it was a moment where I'm like, okay, I don't know where this is going, and I'm excited.
Right. I think one of the big criticisms that you and I have had about the MCU storytelling, especially with like the sequel films, is that they're often kind of timid. They don't really want to move the character too far away from what the sort of ideal of the character is. Like, they don't really want to have the character grow and change a terrible amount over the course of a single film. So even in something like Iron Man 3, which is a pretty good movie, by the end of Iron Man 3, he's still Iron Man. There really hasn't been a whole lot that's changed. He's just finally decided to like have the surgery to get his heart fixed, and for whatever reason, somehow fighting Guy Pearce fixed his PTSD. Can't really tell you how that works. But by the end of Iron Man 3, he's still Iron Man. No big deal. But in this one, they're actually taking story beats that make big, bold choices. And that is extraordinarily welcome for a Marvel film.
Well, I would argue that the Marvel films have made big, bold choices in the past.
They have, but they're still focused on that Stan Lee idea of keeping the characters pretty much the same between films. So there's that level of dependability.
Sure, but I think what makes Avengers Endgame different is a lot of those bold choices often feel plot motivated, whereas Endgame is surprisingly character motivated, which I say surprisingly because a lot of people say, well, the MCU, it's all about the characters. The characters are what matter. And you and I had a discussion about this a little while ago about it's the illusion of character-driven stories, but it's really because these characters are so wonderfully cast and have amazing personality that they make the stories feel more character-driven than they actually are.
Sure. And, you know, when you write a whole bunch of like fairly good quips that all come out of a single character's mouth, you kind of can't help but be charmed about them. It's like being on a date and you realize, oh, this person has a really good sense of humor. You know, date's going pretty well. That's like most MCU movies.
That's a good analogy. But I was very surprised at, especially in the first two acts of this movie, how much it was really letting the characters breathe and react accordingly and make their actions feel extremely like you understand why everybody makes the choices that they make, and even sometimes the choices they decide not to make. For example, when there's this amazing moment, and it doesn't seem that amazing, but for me, it's the moment where I leaned into the movie, which whenever I say, like, when I lean into a movie, I'm like, all right, now you have my, you had my curiosity, but now you have my attention. And the moment for me in Endgame was they kill Thanos. They're like, he destroyed the stones. What are we going to do? Cut to black. And the words 5 years later came up. And I leaned in. I was like, all right, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I had the same moment. I saw that the word 5 appear on the screen, and I just sort of went, oh, really?
I love that they slowly, when just the word 5 comes up, I was like, oh, righty then.
So the next 25 minutes of the movie or so are kind of a riff on The Leftovers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had that. There's a support group, like, what do we do now that they're gone? But these moments in this second act, it's indicative of the best things about Endgame to me, because this movie feels incredibly like a director's cut, and it's not because they get to have these long sequences that feel like deleted scenes. It's an accumulation of small things.
Right.
It's little moments that you're like, you could probably trim this 5 seconds from this scene and it would still function, but it won't have as much character weight. For example, Black Widow, Natasha, has this sci-fi Skype call with a bunch of the now Avengers. And after she's done and she's heard that Hawkeye's been going off murdering criminals and stuff, the movie gives her a little moment to cry and start eating a sandwich before Captain America shows up and they have to have their back and forth. And I'm like, you could just cut to Cap being there as soon as the call ends, and this scene would still do what it needs to do structurally and from a plot perspective. But these little breather moments make the entire thing feel way more impactful.
Yeah, I think Ant-Man's story and the way he sort of re-enters the narrative at this time kind of exemplifies how I feel about the movie. Ant-Man re-enters the story after, what happened to him at the end of Ant-Man and the Wasp, where he gets sort of lost in the quantum realm. The reason he makes it out of the quantum realm is a total bullshit contrivance, total coincidence, where the van that has the quantum gear in it is sitting in storage somewhere, and a rat walks across the dashboard, pushes a button accidentally, and then Ant-Man pops out of the frickin' van in storage. And then, of course, who is sitting there to watch the security cameras to see him but Ken Jeong, who is in Community, which the Russo brothers directed many, many episodes of. So it feels contrived, it feels overly cute within the span of a couple minutes, but then Ant-Man makes it out of the storage unit and then proceeds to go home where the streets are barren. It's legitimately sad. And then he makes his way to a memorial where he then tries to look at all of the big stone slabs that have the names engraved on them to see if he can find the names of his family. And the movie spends like a fair amount of time doing this. It's like, whoa.
Well, to your first point about contrivances, I agree. And there's certainly other instances of that in the movie. But contrivances are kind of part and parcel with the MCU and this kind of comic book storytelling at this point. I'll admit it's a little lazy. They probably could have come up with something that was more clever or more story appropriate to do this or other things like, hey, Captain Marvel just finds Iron Man out there,
I'm sure there's a canonical explanation like, the end of Captain Marvel with that post-credit scene where she shows up. Maybe she showed up on Earth before she actually found Iron Man, and then the transmissions from Iron Man's helmet did actually reach Earth, so they kind of knew where to find him.
Well, regardless...
Yeah, who knows? It doesn't matter.
Well, again, this is all going to be like, well, why don't we see Batman getting back to Gotham in The Dark Knight, right?
Yeah.
This is that plot hole bullshit. Like, it's not important because what matters is the characters. What matters is why are they doing what they're doing? So those little contrived moments, it's like, yeah.
Sure. I think the rat is bigger bullshit than the whole Captain Marvel rescuing Iron Man thing. But regardless, I do agree that it is part and parcel with this sort of movie, particularly when you have this many moving pieces in a movie and you have to bring them together. So sometimes, yeah, it's going to be a little bit convenient. I get it.
Right, which is why I appreciate the moments like you're saying about Scott running around for a while and going to a memorial and going down a street and us, because again, like, you could just have him walk out and see a bunch of, like 9/11 imagery missing posters and get it across in 3 seconds and be like, okay, moving on. But I like that he walks down that street for a while. We get to see that trash is piling up everywhere in the streets. He bumps into a kid who doesn't respond to him. And it's like, this is the kind of stuff that I feel a lot of the MCU doesn't exhale ever. And this movie is full of exhaling.
Right. It is a moment that really lets us soak in the idea, or really a series of moments that let us soak in the idea that the world has changed. The last time we had that, I think the feeling that important was after the first Avengers film, where suddenly people, the entire population of the planet were suddenly aware that aliens could really invade at any time and that superheroes were real. That was a big deal that the MCU decided not to focus on a whole terrible amount and instead decided to kind of build that into the details of the world, like in Iron Man 3 when kids are hunting him down at restaurants going, can we have your autograph? Can we have your autograph? And then they want to talk about what happened in the Avengers. Here, it actually shows us, as soon as you get that 5 years later title card, then it cuts to like a really foggy atmospheric shot of New York City. And you're like, this is not a mood and an imagery I'm accustomed to. We're in uncharted territory for this series. And it was a good feeling.
And it's admittedly overly drab, but this is like a good kind of drab, not
It was appropriately drab.
Right. I like that Cap is at this support, like him being at a support group and kind of leading this support group, still trying to be strong for other people. In that, where there's a cameo by, I think it's Joe Russo.
Yeah. Talking
about a date he went on with a guy and how they both were trying to pretend everything was okay, but eventually they ended up crying. Again, that moment of him doing this story, I was like, you could probably cut about 10 seconds of this and again, still get it all across. But that scene lasted like 15 or 20 seconds more than I expected it to, of Cap and the support group. I'm like, this is what's working, is letting these things breathe and not forcing an expediency on the movie in order to service the plot.
Precisely. Yeah, I agree completely with that. And so we get through this period of the film where Ant-Man finally makes his way to the Avengers headquarters and says, hey, time travel's a thing. And so they decide to get Hulk, who has since become, what do they call him? Professor Hulk, something like that?
Right. I mean, and to be nerdy, he's kind of this movie's version of Mr. Fix-It or Gray Hulk in the comics, which is he's hulked out, but he's sensible. But this one, it's Mr. Fix is like an actual different personality. And this one, it is just Banner as the Hulk.
Right. So it's just big green Banner, basically. And it's cute. And I like when the movies are cute sometimes, but then there are some times where the Marvel movies are cute and I just hate it. Like Guardians of the Galaxy 2, like that was my biggest criticism of Guardians of the Galaxy 2. It was just so aggressively cute all the time and really had trouble managing its like nastier, weirder aspects with its aggressive cuteness. So Endgame is still aggressively cute, and then it also has to balance out this extraordinarily somber thing that happened. The snap was a big deal, and the movie treats it as such, and it actually lets people mourn.
Well, I mean, I think what you're referring to, like when you talk about the Hulk and the cuteness, is they're in a diner and they're talking about what they're trying to do, and a bunch of kids come over to get a selfie with him. And you're like, okay, and it's cute, but then Ant-Man is like, hey, do you want a picture with me? And I'll say this: Paul Rudd is a wonderful human being and a really funny guy, but there are a lot of moments in this movie, particularly with him, that start to feel like they just let him riff like he's in an Apatow movie.
Yeah. There's a couple of lines that he has that actually go on a little too long. It's like he'll say something really funny, and then that's where the joke ends, and that's where the scene transition is supposed to go. But they let him go on for like a couple of lines too long. It's not a huge deal, but it's kind of I don't know, just doesn't feel quite right for the film.
Well, that feels like the wrong idea of this whole let things breathe, let things be what they need to be. That just feels like, yeah, just milk that joke until it's bone dry.
Yeah, it's a couple instances where they needed to get out of the scene a little earlier. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I think you're right in that the fact that they're staying with scenes longer than you would expect them to, given just how much stuff happens in this movie, it's really one of the best things about it. The movie knows what it's supposed to deliver. You know, for so many years, people were excited that we finally had superhero movies where the heroes actually got to sit around and talk and explore what their dynamic was like without being driven by some plot to do plot stuff. And Endgame is really the culmination of all that. Sure, there's plenty of plot and there is action in the movie, plenty of action, but given the ratio of like characters sitting around and talking about stuff that matters to them and all of us to action, like it's very, very talky.
Well, it's only an action movie towards about the fourth act of the movie. Really, the main thrust of the movie, which they're going to time travel back and get all the Infinity Stones, which they dub the time heist. It's like, yeah, it becomes more of a heist structure movie.
Yes.
And there are moments of action within that, but it's not the focus. And that was really fun. And I think some of the most fun moments, obviously, people will love the kind of nods to other characters and stuff like that. But I think that's pulled off in fun ways. For example, talking about fan service, there's a moment where Cap has the scepter during the New York fight, and he gets in an elevator, and it's like, oh, this is like the elevator scene in Winter Soldier.
Yeah, they even brought back Frank Grillo and the one Hydra stooge from Winter Soldier.
Mm-hmm. And Cap's way out of that is to lean into the guy and say, "Hail Hydra," and it's like that's the kind of payoff that I like about Endgame. It doesn't just feel like because, yeah, it's like, hey, that's Frank Grillo. I know who that is. That's kind of lazy, easy, straight down the middle of the field fan service.
Sure, but the MCU movies have already sort of established that little cameos from other people in other movies is a pretty normal thing, and it's become sort of a not special thing. It still feels good to see, of course, but it doesn't quite feel like fan service anymore because it's just status quo for how these MCU movies work.
Agreed. Well, you mentioned action, and I do think we need to talk about action because action is one of our biggest criticisms when we talk specifically about the Russo brothers as directors. And I think what Endgame put into perspective for me is that the action in specifically the Russo brothers movies and these big team-up movies they're more focused on big, punchy ideas and concepts than fluidity or kinetic logic in the scene. Like what matters is the idea of what you're seeing, not how the scene actually happens or how that action affects everything else around everybody. And that's kind of disappointing because there's at least one moment in Endgame that bucks that. And that's a scene in Tokyo with Hawkeye.
Sure, we know at this point, and this is not a huge criticism, this is just a normal thing that, is true of, I think, pretty much any audience en masse, is that audiences care more about what is happening to the characters and what the characters are doing than how it is depicted. They're not really tuned into the specifics and the technicalities of how the filmmakers and the artists have chosen to depict the action. As long as they can tell what is going on, then the film is functional. The filmmaking is functional. The art functions, but it doesn't have an extreme amount of panache. That is the sort of MCU standard for action. It used to not be, but it has since become a movie factory that is churning out like 3 movies a year. So they have to do things a certain way. And the certain way that they do this is they have a certain team that pre-visualizes the big action sequences. So the scene in Tokyo, for some reason, comes off like a John Wick sequence, which was like extraordinarily well executed in terms of like stunt work and camera moves. But then you have Captain America fighting Captain America in New York, and it's like a standard bullshit action scene that is like a little bit of chaos cinema. It's like, yeah, I can tell what is happening because the characters are fighting. I get what's happening, but these shots, the editing sucks in that brief sequence, but for whatever reason, like that Tokyo sequence with Ronin is like, ooh, okay.
Well, yeah, the Cap scene in particular, I don't want to label this as an MCU problem. I think it's a Russo brothers problem. Because I just rewatched Doctor Strange and I was just so, wow, this is not operating in terms of action choreography the way that I think of when I think of MCU movies. And of course that comes to a head, especially in the big final giant army sequence. And there's other cool stuff, which we might mention, but you talk about the action being functional. And I feel like so much of the action, especially in this final fight, is like deathly functional, but I may not have as big of a problem with that if what I was looking at from a visual perspective in terms of color wasn't a nightmare of gray. That final sequence, which I will admit has moments like Cap getting Thor's hammer, or when all of the dusted heroes show back up through all the Doctor Strange portals. I got super pumped when that happened. But when the actual fighting started, it's just like looking at a dumpster puddle of just sludge.
Yeah, I mean, that's harsh, but I get what you're trying to say in that the ground is gray, the sky is gray, the heroes are all covered in soot. It's not a really vibrantly colorful sequence. This is a problem. And when I was thinking about Return of the King and sort of how it did its Pelennor Field sequence, the geography of that is almost always apparent because you have Minas Tirith on one side, and that's visible and immediately obvious what it is you're looking at when you see Minas Tirith. Like, that's incredible design. And then on the other side, you have the volcanic glow of Mordor past the mountains. So you almost always have some sort of landmark in the distance to judge where you are and what it is you're looking at. And then, some sequences will have, a fight that takes place around a fallen Oliphant or something like that. So there's always like little set pieces that give you landmarks that things take place around. This, it's just like a giant field rubble. There's rubble here, there's rubble there. It's just rubble is rubble.
And I don't just mean this from a color perspective. I mean this in a conceptual perspective. There is just not strong contrast in the imagery.
True.
And that's what makes it so muddled. So even though there are fantastic moments in this final fight sequence, I talked about the action movie, the action in these movies, in the Russo brothers movies, being focused on big moments. Like when all the female characters team up to help Captain Marvel play hot potato with the Infinity Gauntlet, and you have them doing all this cool stuff, like Valkyrie zooms up and slices up one of those giant space airworm things. It's like, well, it didn't really matter how she got from point A to point B and how her destroying the airworm did anything to the giant gray void space that she's in. It's just Valkyrie cut the giant airworm in half.
Right. And the fact that you could tell what happened is enough of a functional shot to make people still feel what it is they want to feel when Valkyrie does it. You know what I mean? Like, of course, I think there were way more exciting ways to depict that, and you think about comic books as a medium, they have to capture the emotion and the action of that in a single frame. They have to draw it in the most dynamic way possible because it doesn't move. But the Marvel movies don't really understand that approach of creating an incredible frame. They just sort of let it happen in the most functional way possible.
Again, you say Marvel movies. I want it.
I really do feel it's a bigger trend in these movies. I do think there are exceptions. Doctor Strange, you mentioned, is certainly an exception. But I think this is sort of a systemic problem.
The first Avengers is a, pardon the pun, marvel of translating comic book imagery and framing to filmmaking.
And it is an exception in the MCU. Like, it really is quite different.
At this point, yes. And I think even though we have our feelings about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, again, there's at least interesting attempts in framing the action in that movie. I really think this comes down to these big team up movies like your Civil Wars and Infinity Wars and stuff like this, it's just, I don't think that they are as dynamic as actual comic book storytelling would lead you to believe.
Right. If you want a good idea of what sort of dynamic comic book style framing should be like, watch Scott Pilgrim.
Sure. I mean, that's an extremely exaggerated version of it, but it understands that. Like, it
Right.
has to take it to an extremely formalist level, but in that way, it succeeds.
Sure. And then something else that I want to talk about that I think will come off as a harsher criticism, but I promise it's not going to be that bad. I didn't think there were really any super incredible, indelible new images presented in the movie. There is one shot in the movie where Thanos' new ship, which I guess is not really new because it was the ship he was on during Guardians of the Galaxy, that era, but I think it's the first time we've ever seen it in the films. There is a shot where his ship is sort of looming outward through this gas cloud in space, and the big front of the big front of the ship looks like a face, kind of. And so it looming out through this gas cloud is like, ooh, that fucks. Like it's a really good shot. And then the rest of the movie is basically a greatest hits tour.
Yeah.
It's everything you've seen before. There is really nothing new in terms of imagery to be found. Like, they're literally exploring the rest of the MCU canon in the same settings and with similar looks, and sometimes they're even more desaturated than they were in the originals. Like the stuff where they do in the Dark World stuff on Asgard, it's like a beige nightmare. It just looks really boring. But most of the time, it's playing the greatest hits as well as you could expect to play it. Like it's doing a good job playing the greatest hits, I guess I could say. So I wasn't all that disappointed to find out that the movie was playing its greatest hits when I was still having such a great time. I just wish it brought more new and exciting imagery to the film. Like, I really wish that it brought more cool images that I'd never seen before.
Like, I think this just comes back around to the Russo brothers. Like, they are so incredible. I think their real talent lies in being able to wrangle an enormous amount of huge egos to make these movies, and clearly to make them in what is relatively a fast manner for this kind of giant blockbuster scale stuff.
You have to be a great leader because essentially you have to organize an army. You have to have a good understanding of storytelling to understand what shots you need for what scenes and why. But I think they're some of the most boring visual stylists working in big Hollywood movies today.
Oh yeah, I would not argue that. And even though there are those truly great moments, I think there are great moments in Endgame, but I don't think they're great images.
I would agree. They're kind of shot in the most functional way they could be, and that's okay, but it's only okay. I wish it was exceptional, in terms of the imagery, but it's just okay enough for it to work well.
Agree, but for all the criticism we lob at the MCU, I think I have to tip my hat to this one. It lets the characters breathe and explore difficult elements to the situation that they're in. It's not, even though it is by Act 3 wrapped up in the entire time travel, we got to get the stones heist portion, this feels the most, I don't know, I almost want to say relaxed in a strange way, because these giant team up movies rarely give the characters these kind of moments. I mean, Tony Stark running into his dad when they decide to time travel back to 1970, or Steve seeing Peggy through a window. It's small, but it really adds up.
It does add up in a big way. And yeah, sure, those images may not be super iconic, in the way that they decide to frame them, but the emotion and what they're trying to get across still comes across really strongly. Mostly because we have a deep love for these characters right now. And I think the movie is also capitalizing on, I think, a greater societal need for us to believe that we can win, and that if we do win, we can turn back the clock and make things right again. America being a very divided country, I think both sides, if you want to bring it to a binary, both sides of that division want to feel that way, that they can turn back the clock to the way they want things to be. I think that's a dream, a pipe dream.
That's universal enough. I think what's more important with Endgame is it's not just to win and turn back the clock. It's to win when you have been dealt a devastating loss.
Yeah.
That there is, that this is a darkest before the dawn type thing, but it doesn't come without sacrifice. And there is sacrifice in Endgame. I was certainly surprised that Black Widow would end up being the one to Gamora herself. That kind of came out of nowhere, but talking about this as its own singular entity, it makes perfect sense for Black Widow's arc in this movie.
Right. They actually build up to it, and the whole scene where she's crying and eating the sandwich after getting off the phone with the other Avengers is more than enough groundwork to bring us to that point. Like, it makes complete sense. This really does have astounding character work. It really is an impressive piece of blockbuster writing to be able to sort of wrangle all these arcs into this 1 3-hour movie. I can't help but be in awe. It really is awesome.
No, I really don't have many complaints about character arcs, motivations, or how the characters are used in the story. It all feels right to the point where I think there's a moment in the 5th act, kind of the denouement of the movie, that is going to have people a little frustrated, but I thought was super ballsy. Is once they've all won, Cap has to go back and put all the time stone, or put all the Infinity Stones back where they belong. And normally we would have to see that, and it's just like, okay, we have to watch Cap do a bunch of plot work, but it doesn't do that. It just has him disappear. There's a hint given that no, he's not going to come back actually. And then he shows up as an old man, and it's like, yeah, that's not the best thing for the plot. That's the best possible thing for Steve from his character's perspective and for his arc.
This is one of the things that the movie does that really contributes to it feeling like an ending. So many of these Marvel movies are about sustaining the story from one thing to the next, and there's not a whole lot of movement on the character front and not a whole lot of development on the character front. These tend to be kind of minor stories in a bigger thing, but this one really goes there to bring us to what feels like an ending for Captain America, and certainly for Iron Man.
Oh, I mean, Iron Man, I can't lie. It's badass when he gets to get the final greatest quip possibly in all MCU history. And Thanos thinks he has the stones and says, I am inevitable. And just, I am Iron Man. It's like, hey, look, this has earned it. Like 10 plus years of this, I got to give it to you. That's a moment.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's famous last words, basically, because those were the famous last words of the first MCU film.
Mm-hmm. No, it feels full circle.
Absolutely.
And of course, the movie leaves off with enough of like, hey, no, the adventures will continue. And, now maybe somebody else will be Captain America, and there will be, other people taking up mantles or performing the functions that we've had of other people. But when you have Tony Stark's funeral, it hits. I mean, you and I were talking before we started recording when they send the little floating tribute off
wreath
that has the proof that Tony Stark has a heart. I laughed at first, but then I was like, that's right. That's from, I think, like Iron Man 3 or something.
It's from Iron Man 3 or 2, but what I like about this movie is that it actually is dredging up some of the best material from some of the least memorable Marvel movies, like Thor: The Dark World. The most interesting thing that happens in Thor: The Dark World is that his mom dies. And so they actually brought that back in this movie and said, you know what? There is way too much dramatic potential in this kind of stuff that we haven't mined yet. And so they brought it back, and it actually makes those movies look better in retrospect.
Sure, we didn't really talk about Thor, and I've seen some discussion, that he is mostly played for a joke in the movie, and I think
he is.
I think sometimes that does wear thin, but I get what they're doing. It's like, look, everybody's dealing with this differently, and this is Thor's way, and it's kind of, using humor in a sense, and obviously alcoholism and just everything to deflect. And where I like where Thor ends up in the movie.
It seems a pretty logical choice given what the last Thor movie was like.
Right, the last Thor movie and what he did in Infinity War and everything. But Thor's good, and he's fine. We didn't mention Thor, so I figured we had to do that. And he's, of course, got some wonderful badass moments. Everybody does. Like, it's really across the board. Like I said, I think our biggest criticisms aren't too specific to Endgame. This is more about the MCU in general, and again, I more specifically target the Russo brothers, but they are obvious that their influence spreads outward. But even so, it's really difficult for me to sit here and not say that this movie won me over.
It won me over too, and if we rewind back to Civil War was a movie I enjoyed enough when I was watching it, but I started to notice a really awful trend in that movie. Like the way that it was made seemed so artificial, and it seemed to have forgotten the basic value of being able to put actors in a room and just let good drama happen and to shoot it well. And I thought, if the Russo brothers are going to keep making movies like this, and if as the Marvel movies get bigger, they're going to get more and more artificial, and where stars can't even be in the same room as one another due to shooting schedules or what have you, then these movies are not going to continue to get better. Avengers Endgame, however, disproved that by putting the actors in the same room and letting good drama happen. I mean, sure, sometimes it drops the ball, like that one scene where Captain Marvel comes back and they're all sitting around the big gray-brown room and the lighting is very ugly gray-brown. And it's like, man, this is boring looking. But luckily, throughout the most of the movie, actors are in the room, good drama is happening. That one scene between Robert Downey Jr. and the little girl who plays his kid in the movie, it's like, damn.
It's selling it.
This is good. This is the way this is supposed to work. Yeah. And my audience was just so freaking horny for this movie.
Oh yeah, I mean,
they cheered so frequently and at the right spots. And then when the movie wanted them to cry, these people were weeping around me, weeping, sobbing. It was really incredible.
Yeah, you said. I mean, I didn't have open weeping, but when Iron Man snapped his fingers and he died, and it was his death scene. You could have heard a pin drop in my theater. It was the most deathly still I've heard a theater in a long time.
That death scene too, it's done in such an anti-movie way. You have Thanos right about when you think he might kill Captain America, he starts monologuing like freaking what's his nuts in The Incredibles.
Oh, we didn't talk about
Look at
that.
me, I'm monologuing, Jason Lee. But when Iron Man snaps his fingers, and he really doesn't say much of anything else.
He doesn't. No,
while he's dying.
I was taking note of that. He doesn't say anything after I am Iron Man when he dies. He's
not even really there anymore. He's kind of almost there. Like he recognizes Peter maybe, and you think he might recognize Gwyneth Paltrow's character Pepper, but he's dying, and it feels pretty real. It's one of the things that really makes that moment impactful. He's not doing some sort of monologue at the end. He does get a farewell message that he records holographically as like if you're seeing this right now, I'm dead and none of you are getting my inheritance or whatever.
Right. Well, he gets to have a quippier outro, but the actual death scene, nothing. And I was like, this is so the right decision. And, because it'd be really easy for him to do another, did I get him? Did we win? Or like even small things like that. It's like, just don't have him say anything. Have everybody else react around him.
Yeah. I don't think I'm going to be joining you guys for that shawarma this time,
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, we didn't even talk about Thanos. Because
he's fine. I mean, Josh Brolin does just as good a job in this as he did previously.
Yeah.
And there are sometimes I think that his motivation in this film works better. Like particularly in the final act where he goes, you know what? I'm not about cutting life in half anymore. I'm just going to destroy the universe because this freaking universe is so ungrateful for what I've done for it. It's like he's gone full God mode. And I'm like, you know what? That makes more sense to me.
Yeah, I think Endgame actually highlighted how uninteresting of a character Thanos actually is. They made him up to be, so just a big monologuing, I have the big plan villain thing in Infinity War. But he's not actually that interesting. The only time he's really interesting is in the beginning of the movie when he's like picking fruit and has like a big like cotton weave t-shirt on.
Yeah. Younger Thanos, the one we see from the previous timeline, he's more sadistic. He's a meaner guy. The Thanos we saw in Infinity War was a little bit older, just a couple years older, and you can tell he was sort of resigned to his fate.
It's like evil Zen.
Yeah, exactly. But whereas the younger Thanos, he's got a little bit meaner. He's a little nastier.
What a high note to go out on. I really feel that way, and especially after not being as enamored with Infinity War as everybody else seemed to be. This kind of came as a surprise. I was genuinely surprised by this movie. I was surprised at how much it affected me, how much I really found myself liking what it was doing with its script and how it was moving the pieces around and what it was deciding to focus on. And I think this might be the moment where we have to kind of talk about the MCU on this show.
Yeah. You want to cut right to the chase?
So we loved Avengers Endgame, and like I said, it's a high note to go out on for the Marvel Studios project, but it's also a high note. But it's also a high note to go out on for GenreVision, because we're not going to cover the MCU movies on this show regularly like we have been. We might do some of them as Patreon episodes, and they may not be right when they release, but we don't want to give the impression that we hate the MCU, that we dislike these movies. Obviously, we like quite a lot of them, and they have affected us, but I think the MCU is so much bigger than us, and that I don't think after a certain point what our little show is going to bring to the conversation.
Right. I think after seeing Patrick H. Williams's 3-part video essay on the Marvel Cinematic Universe and, him talking about not only his love for it, but also his biggest problems with it, he says, these movies are good. I wish they could be great. And for the most part, I absolutely agree with his criticisms. And I think he's doing the criticisms of these movies way better than you and I can. So for the time being, and for the foreseeable future, we're not going to feature the MCU movies in our schedule anymore. What Drew said is true. You may hear about them on Patreon. You might hear about them in Currently Consuming, but we're not going to devote full episodes to them anymore. And I actually think it'll be a good thing for me to have a break. Like, I don't know if I'll see Spider-Man Homecoming, or what is it? Far From Home. I don't know if I'm going to see Spider-Man Far From Home in the theaters. I may decide to wait on that one, and I'll let you talk about it. I have no idea.
Yeah, that it might be that. I mean, we might record something for Patreon just talking about the MCU. I don't know, but I kind of want to go out with Endgame. I want Endgame to be our Endgame in a sense, because, and this was not, we were planning to do this regardless of how we felt about Endgame, but it feels really good that it goes out on a really, really good movie.
Yeah, we get the opportunity to both celebrate the MCU as a whole and celebrate this film, which was an absolute blast.
That's Avengers Endgame, and that's the MCU.
That's it.
As far as the show is, our main show is concerned. But we do have to go to the shelf where we pick a movie that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to pick your own shelf picks and go to GenreVision.com and comment with your shelf picks in the comments for this episode. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf?
Well, after this extraordinarily complex and huge blockbuster that represents just how far we've come in comic book cinema, I thought it would be best to go back to basics. So I am recommending Paramount's Superman cartoons from 1941 and 1942, animated by Fleischer Studios.
Yes.
There are 17 of them, and I think the one that most people are familiar with is the second one out of 17. It's called The Mechanical Monsters. It is actually the very first time that Clark Kent ever used a telephone booth to transform into Superman. It is a landmark in animation, and certainly a landmark in superheroes in motion. If you've never seen these Fleischer Superman cartoons, you absolutely have to. They're incredible.
I have to admit, when I was living in Los Angeles and would go to the New Beverly Cinema regularly, a lot of times they would play cartoons before certain features. And one time, I think it was maybe for like Flash Gordon, they played I think it's the first Fleischer Superman card. It's like the Mad Scientist or something, where he captures Lois Lane. And there's this great moment of a laser beam shooting Superman, and he has to punch the laser beam back. It is the most purely distilled take you can get of classic superheroes.
Right. And when you see the quality of the animation on these things, you go like, this is from the early 40s? Like, holy shit, they look great.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can tell that it's dated, but in a way that the style and the sense of purpose makes them feel timeless.
Right. Well, you see like the evolution from the 1930s and sort of like the rubber hose style of cartoon animation. And, Fleischer's kicking all sorts of ass that those things didn't. This is not Steamboat Willie.
No, that's a great recommendation. Well, my shelf pick, I was thinking of other kind of franchise enders, and of course, there's a lot to pick from, and there were some that I thought matched up with some of the criticisms I had about Endgame, but I wanted to pick one that made me feel as, kind of jubilant, but also a little morose. So my shelf pick is The World's End. This is Edgar Wright's kind of closer to a makeshift trilogy, which is typified by Edgar Wright, Simon Pegg, and Nick Frost all working together. And The World's End is about a bunch of characters who are, in a way, one specific character trying to reclaim their past and have to deal with an alien invasion. Which, if I boiled it down very simply, could sound like Endgame. But The World's End, I feel, has been the slowest to be appreciated out of what's called the Cornetto trilogy, which is Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End.
Yeah, I actually know a surprising amount of people that dislike this movie, which blows my mind because I think it's incredible.
It's a phenomenal film, and I think the problem is that trying to fit it in with those other two films somewhat does it a disservice, because it's got a little bit more complicated ideas, because all of those movies are about men that are somewhat stunted in their emotional growth and how they're going to grow out of that through these extraordinary circumstances. But The World's End deals with it in kind of the darkest way.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily dark and fairly sad in parts, and I think that was a little jarring for people. And the ending as well is not this big fist-pumping ending. It's actually kind of a more complex ending that's not nearly as happy for everyone as you think it might be. Like Shaun of the Dead had kind of a similar thing going on, whereas there is this big catastrophic event that changes the world, and certainly changes the main character's relationships with his loved ones. But The World's End goes bigger with that idea, and certainly a more permanent. Yeah, very good shelf pick, sir.
Thank you. And I just, more people need to see The World's End, because I even had a similar reaction when I first saw it. I was like, well, this wasn't exactly what I was expecting when connecting it to these other movies. But in a way, as I get older, I think it's kind of growing on me more and more.
It's not just that, it's a pretty astonishing sci-fi movie as well.
It is. It's wonderful. And of course, it's extremely funny and wonderfully well acted. So yeah, The World's End. Well, let's do some currently consuming.
Nom 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Well, a couple things I'm reading, or have read, really. I read an article on Polygon from Film Crit Hulk, and I'm not always on the Film Crit Hulk train, but when he's right, he tends to be very right. And he did Red Dead Redemption 2 6 months later. And the primary argument in his epic length article is all about design. He talks about just how poorly designed the game was, and just, its menus and every single interaction. He talks about the kind of sheer frustration that builds up over time with that game, of like how complicated it is to do things like brew a pot of coffee or, buy things at the shop. And he talks about when the game doesn't really move at the speed of your thoughts and you're forced to actually slow down and deal with this clunky interface, then that's poor design. It's not immersion if the game is constantly taking you out of it by noticing just how crummy and clunky and everything that design is. And of course, not everybody's going to agree with this. I know a lot of people that loved Red Dead Redemption 2 and like that they felt immersed by the sort of slow pace of every single action you have to take in the game. But I was one of the people that both liked the game and was frustrated by this. And it's the same with Film Crit Hulk.
Well, we did a Patreon exclusive Extended Currently Consuming where we talked at length about our experiences with Red Dead Redemption 2.
Right. So Hulk's recommended reading in this Polygon article was a book called The Design of Everyday Things by Donald Norman. And Donald Norman is a guy who's worked for a whole bunch of companies as a very high-ranking designer. And this is a book all about the psychology of design that I'm currently reading. And pretty interesting read so far. It's a little dry, but it's about things I'm interested in. So
yeah, I've actually heard that title before.
Yeah, it's a pretty common recommendation. You hear a lot about it, particularly if you work in a Silicon Valley company setting like you have.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyway, what have you been currently consuming? Because that's all I got.
Not a whole lot, but I am also going to mention a book. And I'm sure I've mentioned these on the podcast at some point, but it came up in conversation between you and I. I'm rereading Tales from Development Hell, The Greatest Movies Never Made. I have to say it like that because there's a question mark in it. This is written by David Hughes. I came to him from I don't know if it was his first book, but his first book on this kind of subject was The Greatest Sci-Fi Movies Never Made. And loved that. It has a number of great movies that have been very detailed. I mean, that was one of the first places where I read about the trials and tribulations of the unmade version of Alien 3. And I love The Greatest Sci-Fi Movies Never Made, but I've read it like 3 or 4 times. I've only read Tales from Development Hell once, and you and I were talking about it, and you mentioned that you had bought it on Kindle, so I pulled my old copy out and started rereading it, and I forgot the different movies that they talk about. And what's really interesting, and this is true of Greatest Sci-Fi Movies Never Made too, but of course there's stuff in there like, oh, don't you want to know about John Borman's Lord of the Rings or a Total Recall sequel? And it's like, that stuff's fun, but the first movie they talk about is a wonderful example of how the movie everybody wants to make can never get made, because it's a historical drama called Smoke and Mirrors.
Right. Yeah, it was like an Indiana Jones meets Lawrence of Arabia, but also about a magician, the guy who inspired Houdini, and he was going to be played by Sean Connery. It's like, what? And this evidently inspired a huge bidding war?
Oh, yeah. And the movie continued to be in development for over a decade and fell out. I mean, I think it got picked up like in the very early 90s and was still trying to get developed by the time The Prestige and The Illusionist both came out. Like, its life cycle is incredible, but it talks about, it's like, here's this movie that everybody wants to make, and there's this huge bidding war and this huge epic that they're going to try and make, and just how these things fall apart. And I really, really like David Hughes, because he even states, I think in the introduction to the book, where he's like, look, I am a writer, and I even detail in this book my own travails through development hell with screenplays. But when I'm talking about these stories, I do my very best not to editorialize. That I really just want to tell you, this is what we know about the production. This is what people went on record saying, either through his own interviews or archive interviews. And this is what it is. And he tells the story in a wonderful way. And I really think that if you have a love of movies, something like this is kind of essential, because it tells you how not only movies get made, but how movies don't get made. And that's kind of a crucial part of the business.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really important look at how Hollywood works, because most movies don't get made.
Well, that's the thing. Most movies stay unmade, and even the great ones, and even not so great ones, but ones that everybody seems to want to make. So Tales from the Development Hell, it is available on Kindle. I highly recommend that. And before we leave, we do want to do the comment of the week on our last episode, which was Curse of the Demon. And I just finished that episode a day or so ago, and I really liked that episode and really liked that movie.
It's a good movie, and we had a good time talking about it.
We did.
Even if you have not seen Curse of the Demon or Night of the Demon as it's known in the UK, give that episode a listen. You'll like it if you like things like Drag Me to Hell or The Ring or It Follows, stuff like that.
Yeah, just horror. I think it's, like we say in the episode, it is a classic horror movie for a reason. But we only got 2 comments on it, so I'll go ahead and highlight them both. One by loyal listener Eric Fuchs, who talked about not really being in love with the movie because of the character played by Dana Andrews named Holden. But he gave us a shelf pick, which I love to hear. And his shelf pick was It Follows. He says, I didn't have a great one in mind, so I'll just go semi-obvious here. But that's fine. Both Travis and I love It Follows. We even did a tag team review of it back in the day. Wow. Now that I think about it.
It's been a minute.
But also wanted to highlight the comment from our new Patreon subscriber, Fergal, who said, so glad you guys chose this film. I saw it for the first time earlier this year and loved it. And then he talks about why he loved the movie, so go check that out. But he also had a shelf pick, and his shelf pick was John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, another excellent skeptic proven wrong film, as he says. Great shelf pick.
Absolutely. Love it.
Love that movie, and that is a really good pairing. So thank you so much, Fergal, and thank you all for listening. We hope you'll stick around, because next week, what movie could we possibly follow up Avengers Endgame with? It's got to be a movie that everybody's dying to hear about. So, of course, we're going to be talking about Virtuosity, the sci-fi thriller starring Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe, where Russell Crowe is an amalgamated artificial intelligence of a whole bunch of serial killers.
Right. So if you take a whole bunch of digitized personalities of serial killers and you make an AI out of them, you get Russell Crowe. And that character is in Virtuosity. Really, this is the start of a virtual reality month. We're doing Virtuosity. We're doing Existenz by David Cronenberg. We're doing Strange Days, which is a Catherine Bigelow movie. We're doing The Lawnmower Man, and we're doing Gamer, starring Gerard Butler. It's going to be a really fun time, and all of May, we will be in virtual reality.
So please come check that out. As always, we want to thank you all so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision, Virtual Reality Edition.